yesterday got away from me very quickly, as often happens when you travel and then get back to town. So I apologize. But I'm back now and I'm ready to talk about some stuff to do with workshops, stuff to do with our textbook, and stuff to do with just teaching creative writing overall. So what I wanted to start with today, this morning, I don't know what time it is when you're watching this, so that's fine. It's probably snowing if you're any place like where I'm at right now. But I wanted to talk first about our textbook ideas. I'm getting really cool stuff of the proposals. I know it feels like we've kind of already done what I asked you to do with the proposals, but I'm wanting us to really get at a point where we can start thinking concretely about this. And several of you have very good ideas. I want to start writing those soon. When we meet up in class on Tuesday, I am ready to start really getting into specific assignments. I'm going to come in with a more specific table of contents and a more complete introduction than what I've shown you, which is nothing at this point. So we'll get that. You gave me good notes on that last time. A few of you have come to me and kind of asked for guidance on what to write about. A couple people have come to me and said that, I'm really not sure what to write about. One person said that I have a lot of things that I think I could write about, but I'm really not sure what can I do. Is there a possibility of just kind of getting a sense of what is left and choosing from that? And I think that's completely fair. So what I plan on doing is getting that table of contents together based on our conversation, seeing what's left behind in terms of what isn't claimed and what people haven't talked about. And then I can start talking to those of you who haven't claimed something to figure out what will work for you. I'm not just going to assign something unless you're okay with that. But what I'd like for you to do is to just get a hold of me and let me know. And just say, I don't know what to do. You don't have to be that whiny about it. But I don't know what to do. What can you recommend for me? What things do we have? And then once we get all of these other proposals in, I think it'll be easy for us to start looking at it in those terms. So keep thinking about those textbook ideas. If you've already come up with something, I plan on trying to respond quickly to you on that. It's been a little tricky for me because I packed well in leaving Vegas, leaving my mother and grandmother's house in Vegas. But of course, the one thing I left behind was my computer charger, because that's how this always works. So I'm able to use my computer here at work. I'm recording on it. You can't see it, but you can see the magic that it's presenting. And I will get that together. Just been tricky to spend too much time at work for various reasons that I don't need to get into. But I want to talk about workshops. And previously, I gave you a section that I had asked you to take a look at. I gave you this last week. It starts with part 2 workshops. It's got several different things about workshops. I am linking a PDF of it below, but I gave this to you last week, and I mentioned it briefly in class. This is a section that has a few different points of conversation about workshops, and it talks about a lot of really interesting things about workshops. And the first section that it has is about creative writing and creative reading in the poetry workshop. And this section gives us many different types of nuts and bolts, for lack of a better term, that we can look at in the classroom when it comes to workshop. How we talk about imagery and semantic issues and issues of sound and linguistics and form and organization of the line and things like that. I liked it. I like how it gives you this list. It doesn't go into great extensive detail, but maybe that's okay for what this chapter of this book is trying to do. It doesn't need to, because it's mostly just sort of introducing us to some of these basic concepts. Now, what I want to talk to you about first here is how much of the nuts and bolts do we really need to get into in a creative writing workshop. We've talked before about how sometimes too much can be too much. If we provide too much feedback, even if it's good, the writer might end up being a little overwhelmed by what we're providing. Sometimes we maybe can go overboard in presenting anything. I think often when we are introducing a concept or introducing a writing exercise in the classroom, it's very easy to overwhelm the audience or overwhelm our reader, our student, I guess in this case. So we need to be careful about how much we do. So what I want to talk to you about now, and I'd love comments below, because I'll give you some thoughts, but I want to know if it's possible to overwhelm the reader in terms of nuts and bolts. And obviously it is, because we can overwhelm the reader on everything. But how much of the nuts and bolts discussion should we have in the creative writing exercise? And obviously that can mean a lot of different things. Nuts and bolts in poetry can mean talking about form and meter and rhythm and the stuff that comes up in the structure organization statement. um, semantic issues in terms of argument and issues of sound. How much of that should we talk about? And we can talk about this in terms of fiction and drama and creative nonfiction too. But how much do we do? And I think in poetry it's a unique case. If I am teaching a creative writing section on poetry, or if I'm teaching a creative writing class on poetry, if I'm teaching a class that has the workshop component in it, how much do I need to talk about this stuff? Do I need to get into great detail about form and meter? Do I need to talk about iambic pentameters and iambs and dactyls and spondies and all that kind of stuff? Do I have to? Should I? Should I spend a lot of time talking about sonnets and villanelles and sestinas and ghazals and all these things? Should I get into that? And I don't know if there's an easy answer for this. And so maybe the easier answer is what you feel is appropriate and what you feel should work. But there are expectations a student has when they get into a poetry class. And I think it's worth talking about that. What is it when a student comes into a poetry workshop that a student expects to get? Does the student expect to get a discussion about meter? Does the student expect to get a discussion about form? Does the student expect to get a discussion about feelings and thoughts and emotions? Well, that's going to depend on the student, right? I think some students go into creative writing class thinking that they're going to get to learn more about how to write in meter. They're going to get to learn more about how to write in form. Some students might think that and they're not real happy about it. Maybe they're nervous about it. Maybe that's a point of concern. Maybe most people go into a creative writing class wanting to talk about feelings and talk about emotions. Maybe some people get kind of turned off by that. So it's a matter of finding the right way to discuss it. As far as I am concerned, in creative writing classes, I do talk about form on occasion. I will often discuss sonnets and villanelles in different forms. I will. I will often do this in earlier levels too. When I'm in a elementary school class as a visiting poet, I will talk about these things too. I feel that they are, and we've talked about this, but they're interesting challenges to kind of get a student into. I think that it's great for a student to break rules. I love it. I am a total rule breaker when it comes to writing. But I also think it's important for a student to know the rules before they break them. So I generally, at the college level, will assign, I don't know if it's directly in front of me, here it is, Mary Oliver's Poetry Handbook. Those of you who have taken creative writing classes with me before or currently know this and have read this book and probably liked it, at least if you've told me anything about the book, you told me you liked it. But what I like about this book, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is it is very basic but complicated and accessible. And what she's talking about are discussions about the basic way a poem is built using the language that's on the back of the book. So she's talking about just the structure of a poem and the construction of a poem. She's not really talking a lot about emotions and feelings, a little bit, but not much. Mostly she's thinking about how we construct the thing, how we build the artifact of the poem. I like this book, and it has a subsequent book called Rules for the Dance, which gets more into the technical apparatus of the poem. It gets more into the specifics of form and language. And typically for me, in my 3,000 level creative writing classes, I don't feel like we need that. If I'm teaching upper division creative writing classes, beyond that, if I'm teaching like graduate level or higher, or 4,000 level or higher, yeah, then I might want to get into that. And the question becomes why? What's gained by having a long discussion about the meter and the rhythm and the patterns that exist? What comes from that? Why is that valuable for a student? And are there some situations in which a student will actually not only not benefit from it, but also kind of regress because they start thinking about these things in ways that are overwhelming? Yeah, I think that it's valuable because poems are verbal art. Poems are things that are meant to be said aloud. They're meant to be expressed. So if we can learn about rhythm and sound and meter, then I think we're accomplishing something that's kind of interesting. I do not assign my students typically to write lines and lines of rhymed verse or unrhymed blank verse or something like that. I don't do it. I don't think it necessarily is benefiting to us at the stages in which I typically teach. I think that it's a fascinating experiment to try to figure out how to do it. But I think students who have basic understanding of meter, that know how to think about stressed and unstressed or unstressed and stressed words or having double stresses occur, thinking about the sound of a line as a complete artifact of a poem. I think they have an advantage in terms of creating poems that are working on a sound level. So I think it's an advantage to this. Even if a poet later on in their writing doesn't think about those things at all, isn't remotely thinking of dactyls, which is fine. I don't think about dactyls on any regular basis when I'm writing a poem. I don't. But I think if it's there, then you're starting to be conscious of sound in a way that becomes really relevant to us as a writer. So to me, I will talk about some of those things. Will I talk about that at the middle school level? When I've gone into classrooms, I don't typically, but I'm not in there for an extended period of time like I am with others. Will I talk about what a sonnet is? Yeah, sometimes. Sonnets are famous. Sonnets are cool. Sonnets have interesting things that help us understand poems overall. They have turns, right? A sonnet is a 14-line poem. That's the one thing we can agree that all good sonnets have. But then they will have turns that will occur at various points. That they're 14 lines, but maybe after the 8th line, maybe after the 12th line, something happens that turns the poem. And that's interesting to me. Sometimes they are really heavily structured with language, and sometimes they aren't. There are a lot of writers that have done really cool things with sonnets. And those writers aren't just Shakespeare or Petrarch or people that we really equate with the sonnet from years gone by. There are more contemporary poets that have done interesting things. Poet David Rivard has a collection called Mystery Train, where he has a whole bunch of rock and roll sonnets. And some have some structure, and some are visually spread out all over the page. There are poems about the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan and Buddy Holly. And they're fascinating because they don't feel like sonnets, except they're 14 lines, so I guess they are. There are also sonnets by writers in which they kind of deconstruct the form of the sonnet by doing something really outside the box. Like, I think it's Ron Padgett has a sonnet, and it's just the phrase, "nothing in that drawer," 14 times. And I wrote an analysis of it once when I was in grad school, trying to understand how the poem is turning at various points. And the poem is just nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer. And it's 14 lines of that. And if you're reading it aloud, you have to change it, or else you go crazy. You don't read it as nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer. You don't. I don't read it that way. It feels too monotonous, and that's not what that is. I get the sense of that poem of somebody looking for something, right? Nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer, nothing in that drawer. That there's like an urgency that comes up as this character has looked through 14 drawers. Is that a sonnet that would make Shakespeare proud? Probably not. But it's something that's interesting and shows us about the form. So sometimes I like to talk about forms and then provide poems that deconstruct it, that look for poems that challenge the entire format, right? So I like form, and then I like to talk about how we can bust it up. I like talking about nuts and bolts, but I don't like to get just stuck on it too much, because I think that if a writer ends up feeling that the only thing that they can really do to make a successful poem or story or whatever it is to follow these sort of nuts and bolts rules, I think that gets a little overwhelming. Now, the idea of nuts and bolts can be a little bit easy to misconstrue. I'm talking here in this discussion about poetry a lot about formal constructions. I think if we start talking about imagery and voice and character building and construction of personalities within the piece, I think that is not nuts and bolts stuff. I think that's stuff that we absolutely have to talk about. What I think becomes important with that is the question of when. When do we start to talk about this? So let's shift from poetry to fiction. And I included a brief excerpt from something called Editing Fiction, a Process for Creative Critique. This is below here also. And this is very brief. And basically it's just an exercise that helps students kind of think about editing. And so I just wanted to give you this really quickly as an exercise, because I think that that's something we want to talk a lot about. And I thought this was an interesting exercise because it's asking somebody to take a story that already exists and start to edit it and think about how you edit something and how you revise it. And so one question that we have to have when it comes to writing creative creative writing for our students and what we're here for is what exactly we're striving to do in the workshop. What are our goals in a creative writing workshop? So not just a class overall, but in a workshop. And I think there are, simply put, two main things that we are striving for as goals in the creative writing workshop. And one of those is to become, for our students, to create better writers amongst our students. I think that's an obvious thing. We're in a creative writing workshop because we are interested in creative writing, hopefully, and we want to be better at it. So one of the main goals of the creative writing workshop is to create better writers. Another goal is to create people who are better equipped to talk about writing. That's important. That one gets lost a little bit. If everybody in the workshop just comes in and says, that's good, or I like this, and then can't really say why, then that becomes a problem. So we need to make sure that we are equipping our students to really be able to understand how to talk about this stuff. And so the question I want to ask you, and you can talk about this below, is when do we talk about this? Do we start our semester with workshop discussions prior to getting into workshop that talk a lot about this? Do we have a long discussion in which we spend a couple of potentially class periods in a shorter class talking about, okay, if we're talking about poetry, this is what imagery is. If we're talking about fiction, this is what character is. Do we spend a lot of time talking about how we discuss character? Do we have long discussions amongst ourselves before we get into the workshop to talk about character? If we do that, then we can assume that likely our students, when we get to that point, are going to have a better ability to handle the situations that will come up in a creative writing discussion. Or do we maybe do a little bit of that? Do we spend some time talking about some of the guidelines and pieces of advice for looking at fiction or looking at poetry or CNF or drama? Do we do some of that and then kind of let the workshop go? So maybe I spend an abbreviated discussion getting into workshop discussions to understand how to deal with workshop, and then we go. Or do I just jump in? Do I just have the class all jump in together into the coldest water that we can find and just deal with it as we go? You could probably tell that of those options, I would not suggest a third one. I think that it's okay to expect students to bring something in their ability to talk about creative work, to talk about writing into a workshop, but I think it's a really good idea to make sure that we've done something to set it up. If we just jump in, we'll just say first week of class, hey, we're doing creative writing. Maybe we even do a really basic primer on what makes for a good story, something like that, and then say, hey, you're bringing in a short story next week, so are you. We're going to workshop it. And then those students bring in those workshop stories. What happens? Well, students might not know how to talk about them. They might end up with comments that are too glowing in a general way or too critical. And that might help slow the emotional progress of a writer from being achieved. Maybe we end up not teaching enough of the language as it goes on. So students will say, I really like this, but I don't know why. I kind of like this sentence, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. And as the teacher, you'll prompt them. Like, well, what is it about it? It's like, I don't know, I just like it. And eventually they'll get there. But are we taking time away from having beneficial conversation about a student's creative work in order to talk about this thing that we could have talked about a week before? Or, and this is the worst, and this is going to happen possibly to you in other situations, but it's when you've read the workshop story, you say, okay, student who wrote the story, you're going to listen to us now. What does everybody think about the story? And then crickets. And unless you have a class in which your students are all crickets, this is bad. You don't want there to be silence. You want people to feel comfortable. And you might think, well, why aren't they talking? And as a teacher, my first instinct whenever a student is not talking is they didn't read it. You'll get there. Maybe you're already there. Oh, they didn't read it. This sucks. But that's not always it, right? There are situations in which we have read the material and we simply don't know what to say, right? This happens. This happens in literature classes that if they're, and this maybe has happened to you in other classes, it certainly happened to me as an undergrad, where I have taken a class. There was homework, reading assignment. I read it. I totally read it. I'm not just telling you I read it. I totally read it. And then the teacher gave me a quiz, and I didn't do that well. Well, why? I read it. I felt like I was ready to talk about it. I felt like I could have had a discussion, but something went wrong. I'm not blaming the teacher for an unfair quiz, although maybe at the time I would have. I'm not doing that now. I'm saying that there was something that I did wrong. And maybe what I did wrong is when I was reading the material, I wasn't as focused on it as I could have been. Maybe I was thinking about what I was going to have for dinner or what movie I was going to go see that weekend or something like that, and I wasn't focused fully on what I should have been focused on. Maybe that happens. But I think in the creative writing class, there are times in which students have not read the work. It's obvious. But then there are other times in which the student has, yet he or she doesn't know what to say because perhaps we haven't done enough to fill that student with confidence in their ability to say something that matters or the language to say something that matters. So to me, I think having the discussions about the stuff that's in specifically in that poetry section, and maybe even a little bit in that prompt that I gave you, in which the exercise is asking for students to provide immediate expressions and then make sure that they really talk about the terms that they're using and the language that they're getting across. When we start to do that, then the students start to feel more comfortable. And then they could say, I really liked this because I liked the imagery. I liked the visuals. It made me think of this. So I am not saying that we should just start off the semester with weeks and weeks and weeks of prep and then eventually do workshops. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you don't learn more as you go on through a workshop, because you totally do. You absolutely will. Because what students are going to learn as they go on through a workshop is the language, because we'll start to use it. You, as the teacher, will use it. You will talk about these things. You will talk about specifics about point of view or specifics about whatever it is that will go into the story. You will talk about that as it goes on. So the student will gain that language. The student is also going to learn more about other types of fiction or writing, because you'll likely assign those things over the course of it. You'll have the students, at least you should, reading other creative work by writers who are published and not in the class. So they'll have that. So that I eventually in the semester will have a student say, well, this really reminds me of that poem that we read by so-and-so earlier on. Or this reminds me of how Dennis Johnson does this, or this poem reminds me of the way that Mary Ruefle does this, or something like that will help us understand the context by understanding what other writers have done. You'll also get a better sense of the student's body of work. And so it's hard not to look at the first poem you see from a given student in a vacuum, because you don't know what else they're capable of. But as it goes on, that vacuum is not a vacuum anymore. And you start to see a body of work that develops. And so that's also an important thing that happens over the course of the semester. Maybe when it comes to creative nonfiction or fiction, if you're dealing with full short stories and that's the bulk of what you're looking at, maybe it's hard to really get a sense of what that student's body of work is. But you'll get there. You're going to get enough pages to get a sense of it. So to me, I like to typically provide, and I get to do this because I feel that most of my creative writing students come in with some understanding of how to discuss creative work. Now, they're probably coming at it, most, though not all, are coming at it from a perspective of knowing how to discuss creative work in an academic classroom. So I'm in a creative writing class. Maybe I haven't done a lot to talk about creative writing. Maybe I have a friend who's written some stuff, or I've written some stuff and people have talked about it. I don't know a lot about that, but I can talk about John Updike's A&P, man. I've had a lot of discussion about the Sonny's Blues. So I know how to look at creative writing, and I know how to talk about this. Now, is it different, the way that we talk about A&P in a literature class than it is in the creative writing class? Of course it is. But you know stuff. You have a little bit of that background. Don't tell a student to forget all that. Use it. But then kind of cultivate it in a way that's more toward creative writing. So what I do in my creative writing classes is typically I will provide a list of questions we ask when we are revising or we're workshopping creative work and we're asking students to revise based on our feedback. So I provide like a list of 10 series of questions that are all about different parts of writing to just have that conversation and look for it. I feel like that's enough. to me in the classes that I've got. And then students are usually able to kind of build on that as we go based on those other things that we develop as we go on. So I don't feel like it's essential to provide too much, but I think you ought to have something. I think that the idea of just jumping in cold to a creative writing class is really a bad idea. Because students are probably going to feel really, really out there. And if you have conversations with a lot of your creative writing students, some are going to be confident and some aren't. To me, typically I find that in fiction classes, students are more comfortable. They're more confident. They've probably done it. They've probably read more about this. They feel, in some cases, that they can write a novel that's going to be successful. And I don't ever want to detract a student from feeling that. I've had students who've written novels. I have students who come in to fiction classes working on the third novel in a series. So I have students who come in with a lot of confidence. I'm not trying to break that confidence. I just want to make sure they're thinking about the creative writing that they could be doing, if they're thinking a lot about what a thoughtful reader is looking for, not just a genre reader. So I don't want to necessarily pull them out of the realm of genre fiction, but I want to talk about what discussing realistic fiction or maybe more critically acclaimed fiction can help with in that. Most poetry students come in, they don't have as much an idea of what a good poem should be. They haven't maybe written a lot. Maybe they've written some. Maybe they wrote a lot in high school. Maybe you've written some in undergrad that you haven't shared with a lot of people. Maybe you wrote poems kind of dealing with difficult points in your life or something like that. I think that happens, and that's great. And yet a student comes in to that creative writing poetry class a little less confident. When it comes to creative nonfiction, I think that becomes something a little bit in the middle. I think that we have students who maybe are more comfortable writing essays than they are poems, but maybe aren't really sure what the difference is between creative nonfiction and fiction. Maybe that becomes a challenge. I'd love to get more feedback. I know several of you have done a lot of work in creative nonfiction classes, and I'm curious about what students, like in your classes, what do you think students come into a creative nonfiction class thinking? Do they know nothing about it? Are they viewing it in a different way? I'd love to get your opinions on all of these things based on your own experiences and those of people around you. I think that would be really, really valuable. So I think that another thing that's worth talking about in terms of poetry and fiction and drama and creative nonfiction, and this is something I'd love to see you talk about below, are their workshops different? Is a poetry workshop fundamentally different than a creative nonfiction workshop? Obviously, the genre is different, but what else changes? Are there other things that become different? Is the fiction workshop fundamentally different than the creative nonfiction workshop? One thing that I found interesting in this section, the long section that I had you read for today, or this week, since I expected this to be up a little bit earlier in the week, was a discussion in that section, chapter 5, that kind of tapped into the structure of the workshop. And it talks about the resistance to modifying the workshop and the way that workshops were taught. And I'm not that much older, but when I was taking workshops and creative writing classes in the 1990s, they are not fundamentally different than what we're doing now. In fact, in very many cases, I don't know if they're any different. Does that mean I'm a dinosaur, that I'm just teaching workshops in the same way that I was taught back then? Maybe. But I think really what it is that there's something about the creative writing workshop format that really works. That there's something about it, this idea, and the book talks about this, is that the idea of students as apprentices that are taking positions as novices in the face of language and becoming awed by its subtleties. There's something really effective and appealing about this. So the idea that a student comes into the creative writing workshop and it feels like it's more hands-on. It's not like the rest of academia has caught up to the intimacy of the creative writing workshop. I don't think that's true. I don't know. But if you are taking classes in history, probably they don't have that level of intimacy, or especially in the sciences. But the creative writing workshop kind of hit on something early that didn't necessarily need, in my mind, to be modified that much. What we're doing is we're kind of, as it says, taking them on as apprentices. We're letting students have a hands-on experience in a way that doesn't happen in a lot of classes. The creative writing teacher generally is someone who's kind of sits at the table with everybody else as an equal. as we've talked about, I don't generally get to teach creative writing classes or have to teach creative writing classes in that single classroom format. You're all over the place. Hi, everyone, in all your various locations. I don't do that. But when I go back to other schools who don't have the broadcast system that allows for the possibilities that USU does, shameless USU plug, it is exactly what I remember. I went to Westminster as a visiting writer in September of last year, and I was a guest in a writer's creative writing class. And it was exactly what I remembered. It was in an old, musty classroom. We all got around in a circle, and the teacher and the visiting writers were just part of the circle. We were all equals, except the students knew that they were apprentices. And I think that there's something that is timeless about that. And that's probably why this format hasn't changed. Has it been modified by certain writers? Of course. I want you as a teacher to do different things. I want you to find your thumbprint that makes it uniquely yours. But it's funny to me as a teacher, because in my comp classes, what I'm doing, just in terms of my methods and my approaches, is light years beyond what I was doing when I was in composition classes in the 90s. Very different. I'm using technology in ways that is changing what I can do. I'm doing all sorts of different things. But when it comes to creative writing, I don't think it is that much different. And I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Now, obviously, you don't have the experience. You weren't taking creative writing classes in the 80s and the 90s. But from when I've talked to other people, this formula has not changed. Should it? Or is there something about this workshop that makes it feel timeless? I'd love to hear your feedback on that, to get a sense of that. Why is it that there's this resistance to modify? In teaching these days, and most of you, it seems, are studying pedagogy. Many of you are, and maybe have attended teaching conferences. And when I go to a teaching conference, everything we're talking about, we've been talking about flipping the classroom for a decade, but people want to talk about that. People want to talk about all these methods of using clickers and engaging your students through media and doing all these things that is so different than what I remember when I was in college, in high school. We didn't do any of that stuff. But when it comes to creative writing, we're kind of doing the same thing. Why? And is it okay? I think it is. But as I said, maybe I'm a dinosaur. So maybe that's it. So there are some of the questions that I want to talk about below. Are poetry, fiction, drama, creative nonfiction workshops different? And if they are, how so? What is it that happens in a creative nonfiction workshop that's different than what happens in a fiction or a poetry workshop? Tell me. I'd love to get a sense of that. So write those comments below. We talked about what are we striving to do in the workshop. My thought was that we are striving to teach students how to become better writers and better critics of creative writing. Do you have other thoughts? Because that's simplifying it. There's a lot of other stuff we're doing too. But I think there are things that we're very clearly not striving to do in a creative writing workshop. I'm not striving to help my students become better at grammar. I'm not striving to help my students become better at punctuation. I don't talk about those things unless I feel like I have to. So what do you think about that? What are we striving to do? And maybe following up on that, what are we defiantly not doing? Right? And then, as we talked about at the beginning of things, how much of the nuts and bolts of writing should we discuss in a workshop? How much of the formal structures of poetry should we get into? I would love to hear from you on this, and so I will. So please, below in the comments, tell me about this stuff. And I'm a little bit backed up on getting responses to some of your comments here, but I'm gonna get there. I'm gonna get my charger back on Friday so I can actually work at home, which is cool. And as I glance out my window, I assume I'm about to get snowed into my office, but not yet, so I might sneak home. But I look forward to hearing your comments and feedback on this. I think there are wonderful discussions to be had here. If you have not given me a proposal for your chapter section, please do that. If you are not sure what to do, contact me and we can work toward figuring something out. Thank you all. I enjoyed talking at a computer with the hopes that somebody's listening somewhere down the line. And I look forward to getting some feedback from you to make sure that you did listen. All right, thanks everybody.